The order came so quietly that I almost missed it. Crown Prince Rowan stopped me in the corridor outside the Rose Parlour, looked me in the eye and said, "No one enters this room today. Not the Chancellor, not my brothers, not the King himself, unless I send for them by name. Do you understand me, Corin?" I said yes, of course, the way you say yes to a man you have guarded for 6 years and would guard for 60 more. I did not yet know that before the sun went down, I would stand in that doorway and, with nothing but a raised hand and a level voice, ask the Queen Consort of Eldermore to wait. My name is Corin Hale, and for 11 years I have worn the red of the Royal Guard at the palace at Harrogate. I was not born to any house worth mentioning. My father mended harness leather for the royal stables until his hands gave out, and my mother kept the ledgers for a wool merchant in the lower town. I joined the Guard at 18 because a recruiting sergeant told me, not unkindly, that I had the build for it and the patience for it, and patience, it turned out, was the rarer gift. Most young men who come to us can be taught to stand straight. Fewer can be taught to stand still while someone shouts in their face, or weeps in their face, or simply waits, hour after hour, for nothing at all to happen. I learned that discipline from a man named Captain Osric Vane, who trained me in my first years, and who used to say that the whole of our office could be reduced to one sentence: "The door does not care who you are." I did not understand him then. I understood him completely by the end of that long day in the Rose Parlour. I had been assigned to Crown Prince Rowan's household guard for 6 of my 11 years, and in that time I had come to know his habits the way you come to know the habits of any person you spend the better part of your waking hours near. The way he took his coffee black and drank it too fast when a council session had gone badly. The particular set of his jaw before he had to deliver news he did not want to deliver. The fact that he greeted every member of the household staff by name, down to the boy who swept the stable yard, because his mother had raised him to believe that a man's manners were worth nothing if he only spent them on people who could do something for him in return. I mention this because I think it matters to understanding why I trusted him as completely as I did that morning, without needing more than the little he was able to give me. Trust, in a post like mine, is not built in a single conversation. It is built across hundreds of small mornings, most of them entirely unremarkable, until the day arrives when a man asks something difficult of you and you find you already know in your bones that he would not ask it lightly. I should explain what the Rose Parlour was, because by the time this story matters, everyone in the palace understood its weight, but a stranger to Harrogate would walk past it without a second glance. It sits at the end of the West Gallery, a modest room with tall windows facing the old rose garden, paneled in pale wood gone honey-colored with age. It had belonged to the late Queen Isolde, Crown Prince Rowan's mother, who died when Rowan was a young man and Torrin, Malin, and Bram were not yet born to imagine. Since her death the room had mostly stood closed. Servants aired it twice a year. The family visited it rarely, and always alone and always briefly. It was not forbidden. Nothing in that palace was ever formally forbidden to the family, but it had become, without anyone declaring it so, a room you did not enter unless you had a reason that mattered. That morning, Rowan had a reason. I could see it on him before he said a word. I had stood post outside his private study countless times, watched him receive ambassadors, ministers, weeping petitioners, furious lords, and in all of it his face rarely changed more than a soldier's on parade. That morning, walking the West Gallery with a flat wooden case under one arm, he looked like a man carrying something heavier than its weight. His step was careful. He kept glancing at the case as though it might open itself. And when he reached the parlor door, he did not simply nod for me to stand aside, as he usually did. He stopped. He set the case down against the wall briefly, and looked at me the way a man looks at someone he is about to ask a great deal of. "I need the room secured," he said, "completely. No interruptions, no exceptions, no matter who asks or how they ask it. If someone insists, you tell them I gave the order myself, and you do not open that door for anyone until I open it from the inside." He paused. "I mean anyone, Corin. I need you to hear that part clearly." "Understood, Your Highness." "I am not being dramatic," he said, and there was something almost apologetic in it, as if he thought I might assume he was indulging some princely whim. "This is not a matter of state security. No one is in danger. It is—" He stopped himself, glanced at the case again, and seemed to decide the explanation could wait. "It matters to me more than most things have in a long time. That is all I can tell you right now. Can I trust you with that much and no more? I have been asked a great many things by a great many important people, and most of those requests are easy because they ask for exactly what the uniform is built to give: a still body, a closed mouth, an unmoved face. This was different. He was not asking me to be a wall. He was asking me to hold a door against people I respected, admired, and in some cases loved without being able to tell them why, and to do it in a way that would not wound them. That is a harder thing to ask of a man than it sounds, and I think Rowan knew it, because he did not walk away the moment I said yes. He waited until I said it plainly. "You can trust me completely," I told him. "I'll hold it." Something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders loosen when a weight has been shared even if it has not been lifted. He picked the case back up, thanked me by name. He always used names, a small thing that a great many royals never learned to do, and went inside. I heard the bolt slide across from the inner side. It was not a sound I had heard from that door in all my years standing near it. The Rose Parlour did not usually need a bolt. I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that first hour, because I think it matters to the rest of what happened. I did not assume anything sinister. I have stood close enough to this family for long enough to know the shape of real trouble when it walks past me, and this was not that shape. Rowan had not looked afraid. He had looked like a man about to do something difficult and important, the way a man looks before a hard conversation with someone he loves, or before opening a letter he has waited years to read. My guess, and it was only a guess, was that this concerned his mother. The room told me that much on its own, but guessing was not my job. Standing was my job, and so I stood. Roughly 20 minutes later, a page came trotting down the gallery with a folio of correspondence for the prince's signature, the ordinary traffic of a palace morning. I stepped into his path before he reached the door. "His Highness isn't receiving correspondence this morning," I said. "I can hold that for him, or you can bring it back after midday." The boy, Petrus, one of the younger runners, earnest and a little literal-minded, blinked at me. "But it's urgent, Guardsman Hale," Lord Steward said. "I understand it feels urgent," I said, keeping my voice even, "and I'm not doubting the steward. But His Highness gave a direct order that this room is not to be disturbed today, without exception. That includes correspondence. I'll see it's brought to his attention the moment he's free." Petrus hesitated, weighing the steward's urgency against a guardsman's flat refusal, and in the end did what most people do when a rule is stated plainly and without apology. He accepted it. He left the folio with me. I set it on a side table in the gallery, well away from the door, where I could watch it and the corridor both, and went back the way he'd come, more curious than annoyed. I did not think much of it. Turning people away from a closed door is, in the ordinary run of things, the least interesting part of my work. I had no way of knowing yet how many more times I would do it before the day was through, or how much heavier some of those refusals would feel than others. The second visitor of the morning was more interesting, because he did not come up the gallery like an ordinary courtier. He came from the garden side, through the low arched door that led onto the rose beds, and I recognized him before he had fully stepped into the light. An old man, thin, silver-haired, dressed plainly in a traveling coat rather than court clothes, carrying a leather satchel pressed to his chest with both arms as though it contained something fragile. He looked entirely out of place in that gallery, and entirely certain of where he was going. He stopped when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said, in a voice roughened by age but not unsteady, "I'm expected. My name is not one you'll know, but the prince is expecting me. He said there would be a guard at the door who'd know what to do." "Your name, sir, if you don't mind my asking." "Halric Bayan," he said. "Though it won't mean anything to you, and it shouldn't. Tell him the box is here if he needs telling. He'll know what that means." I did not open the door myself. Rowan had been plain about that, but I gave 2 measured knocks, the private signal we had settled on before I let him disappear inside, and after a moment the bolt slid and the door opened a hand's width. Rowan's face appeared in the gap, and when he saw the old man behind me, something crossed his expression that I had rarely seen on him. A kind of held-breath relief, the look of someone who has been waiting for news they were afraid might not come. "Mr. Bayan," he said, "thank you for coming yourself." He glanced at me. "He's expected, Corin, he goes in. No one else still, you understand the difference." "Understood, Your Highness." The old man gave me a small, courteous nod as he passed, as if he, too, understood exactly what kind of door he was walking through and did not take it lightly. The bolt slid home again behind him, and I was alone in the gallery once more, with a folio of unread correspondence on the side table and a great many hours still ahead of me. I did not know then who Halric Bayan was, or why a thin old man in a traveling coat mattered enough to warrant the single exception to an otherwise absolute order. I would learn it before the day was done, and when I did, I would understand why Rowan had looked the way he looked that morning, carrying something far heavier than a wooden case. But for now my task was simpler than understanding. My task was the door, and as the morning wore on toward midday, the gallery began to fill with the ordinary business of a royal household that did not yet know one of its rooms had become, for a single day, the most closely guarded place in the entire palace. I want to say something here about what it means to hold a post like that, because I think people who have never done it imagine it as passive, as though standing still were the same as doing nothing. It is not. Every person who came down that gallery required a decision, who could be turned away with a simple word, and who required an explanation. Who would accept, "His Highness is not receiving visitors," without further thought, and who would press, and how to hold firm without giving offense to people who, in nearly every other circumstance of their lives, were not accustomed to being told no. By midday I had turned away 4 members of the household staff, a junior secretary from the Treasury office, and one of the palace physicians who had come, out of habit rather than urgency, to ask after the prince's health following some minor complaint from the week before. Each of them I handled the same way, courteous, brief, unmovable. Each of them left a little puzzled, and none of them left angry. Then, a few minutes past the hour, I heard a different sort of step on the gallery floor, unhurried, unmistakable, a step I had heard announced by ushers 100 times before it ever needed announcing, and I understood that the easy part of my day had ended. Queen Consort Morwenna came around the turn of the gallery with 2 of her ladies, a respectful pace behind her, dressed for the afternoon in soft gray wool, a shawl of Harrogate blue over one shoulder against the draught that always found that corridor no matter the season. She was not hurrying. She rarely hurried. It was one of the things people who did not know her mistook for coldness, when in fact it was the opposite. A woman who had learned, over a great many years in a great many rooms far less friendly than this one, that haste read as anxiety and anxiety invited scrutiny she had no wish to invite. She saw me a good 20 paces off, and if anything her step slowed further, curiosity rather than concern crossing her face. "Guardsman Hale," she said, arriving before the door and folding her hands lightly at her waist. "I don't believe I've ever seen you posted at this door in all the years I've walked this gallery. Is His Highness in?" "He is, Your Majesty." "Good, I wanted a word with him." He seemed distracted at breakfast this morning, barely touched his plate, which for Rowan is practically a fever symptom, and I told myself I'd look in on him before the afternoon council. It won't take long. She had already half-turned toward the door as she spoke, the easy motion of someone who had never in her life needed to ask twice to enter a room in her own household. This was the moment Captain Vane's old lesson stopped being a phrase I repeated in my head and became a thing I had to actually do, in front of a woman whose good opinion I valued, and whose displeasure could, in theory, make my life considerably harder. I stepped, not forward exactly, but into a position that made clear, without a hand ever touching her, that the door was not presently open to anyone. "Your Majesty, I'm very sorry, but His Highness gave orders this morning that the room isn't to be disturbed. No visitors at all, until he sends for them himself." She stopped. For a heartbeat her expression did something I could not quite read, surprise, certainly, and something underneath the surprise that might have been the first flicker of a dozen different assumptions, the kind any person forms when told a door is suddenly closed to them and not to others. I watched her consider several of those assumptions, and to her credit, discard them before they could take root in her face. "Is he unwell?" she asked, and the question came fast and plain, no performance in it at all. "No, Your Majesty, he's well. I saw him not an hour past, in good health and good spirits, only occupied with something he once kept private for now." "Private from whom?" "From everyone, Your Majesty. Those were his exact words. Not the Chancellor, not his brothers, not the King. He didn't make an exception for anyone by name." I paused, because I thought it mattered that she understand the shape of the order rather than simply the fact of my refusal. "I turned away a physician not 20 minutes before you arrived. I held back the prince's own correspondence. I'm not choosing to stop you, Your Majesty. I'm holding the same line for everyone who's come down this gallery today." I watched her take that in, and I want to be honest that I did not know in the moment which way it would go. I had heard enough gallery talk over the years to know that Morwenna's temper, when it rose, could rise sharply, and that she had, on more than one occasion, made her displeasure known to people who deserved it a good deal less than I might, standing between her and a door in her own son's, her stepson's, home. But her temper, when it came from being crossed by design, by someone acting against her specifically. This was not that. I think she understood, faster than I expected, exactly what kind of moment this was, because her shoulders eased, and something that was almost amusement moved at the corner of her mouth. "You turned away a physician," she repeated. "I did, Your Majesty." "And the Chancellor's correspondence?" "His secretary's page, yes." "Well," she considered the closed door for a long moment, and I watched several years of a complicated public life move behind her eyes, because I do not think Morwenna, of all people in that palace, needed the situation explained to her twice. She had spent the better part of 2 decades learning exactly how many doors in that building opened for her without question, and exactly how much that mattered to the people watching, and exactly how rare and valuable it was to see a rule that did not bend for rank. I confess, I don't love being on the wrong side of a closed door, Guardsman Hale. It isn't a position I find myself in often these days, and I won't pretend I've entirely lost my taste for being let in wherever I like. The corner of her mouth moved again, more openly this time, but I find I like this rather better than the alternative. "The alternative, Your Majesty." "A guard who opens doors for some people and not for others," she said, "depending on how loudly they knock, or how important they think themselves, or whose favor they'd rather keep. I have stood on both sides of that particular door in my life, Guardsman Hale, more than you would guess, and I promise you the version where everyone is held to the same rule, even when it's inconvenient for me personally, is the one I trust." She glanced past me at the closed parlor, and something softer crossed her face, something almost wistful. "Rosalind, the old Queen Mother, before your time here properly began, used to say the whole of the crown's dignity rested on whether the newest guardsman in the yard would tell a duke no as readily as he'd tell a beggar no. I didn't understand what she meant until I'd been in this family long enough to watch it happen both ways." She looked back at me. You've just shown me the right way. I'm glad of it, even standing here on the wrong side of the door." I did not know quite what to say to that, so I said the only honest thing available to me. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I don't enjoy telling you no. I want you to know that." "I should hope you don't enjoy it," she said, with real warmth now, no edge in it at all. "If you'd enjoyed it, I might have worried about you." She adjusted her shawl, glanced once more at the door as though weighing whether some further plea might move it, decided against it with a small private smile, and turned to go. Then she paused, halfway into her turn, and looked back at me with an expression I would remember for a long time afterward. "Whatever he's doing in there," she said, "I hope it's good for him. He's carried a great deal quietly, for a long time, that boy. If a closed door and a stubborn guard is what he needs today, then you have my blessing to hold it exactly as firmly as you have been." She smiled, this time without any reserve at all. "Tell him when he's finished that his stepmother came by, was refused entry by the most polite and immovable young man in this entire palace, and thought rather more of him for it than she would have if you'd simply waved me through." She left the way she had come, unhurried, her ladies falling in behind her, and I stood there for a moment turning over what had just happened, because it had not gone the way I had braced for. I had expected, if I am honest, some measure of friction, not cruelty. Morwenna was never cruel, but perhaps a flash of the old imperiousness that people who did not know her well liked to gossip about. Instead, I had been handed, without asking for it, a small and unexpected gift: the plain approval of a woman who understood, better than almost anyone in that palace, exactly what it meant to watch a rule hold firm even when it inconvenienced the very people who were usually exempted from it. I thought about what she'd said about Queen Mother Rosalind, and about standing on both sides of that particular door in her life, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how much of the Morwenna the broadsheets liked to write about bore any real resemblance to the woman who had just walked away from a closed door smiling. Word of the exchange traveled faster than I expected. By the time the bells rang for midday, I had already fielded 2 curious glances from passing footmen who clearly knew something had happened at the Rose Parlour door, though none of them knew what, and one of the under-stewards, a sharp-eyed woman named Fedora who ran the linen stores, and heard everything a full hour before anyone else in the building, stopped at the far end of the gallery just long enough to say, "I hear you turned away the Queen Consort herself this morning, core and hail, and lived to tell of it." "I did," I said, "and she thanked me for it, if you can believe that." Fedora raised her eyebrows, filed the information away with the visible satisfaction of a woman who traded in exactly this kind of currency, and went on her way. I did not think much of it at the time. I did not yet understand that the story of the guard who had stopped the Queen Consort at a locked door would, by evening, have traveled through every servants' hall in Harrogate in half a dozen different and increasingly exaggerated forms. In one version I heard later I had drawn my sidearm. In another, Morwenna had wept. In a third, entirely fictional and faintly insulting to us both, she had tried to bribe me with a ring off her own hand. None of it was true. What was true was simpler, and I have come to think, a good deal more remarkable than any of the versions the servants' hall preferred. A woman with every reason in the world to expect every door in that palace to open for her had been told no, plainly and respectfully, and had chosen grace instead of grievance. I did not know it then, standing alone in the gallery with the midday light coming long and gold through the tall windows, but that choice of hers would matter again before the day was through, in a way neither of us could have predicted. Not long after Fedora went on her way, and before the afternoon properly settled into its long quiet, I had one more visitor I have thought about more than almost any other that day, though at the time it seemed the smallest and least consequential encounter of the whole morning. Prince Rowan came around the gallery corner alone, still in his lesson clothes, a slim book of history tucked under one arm as though he had wandered off from his tutor's schoolroom between one page and the next, drawn by nothing more than a boy's restless curiosity about a part of the palace he did not often have reason to visit. He was 11 that spring, tall for his age the way boys sometimes are right before they settle into themselves, with his father's same habit of studying a room before he spoke in it. He stopped a good distance from me, the closed door plainly visible behind my shoulder, and regarded me with the frank, unhurried directness children bring to questions adults have usually learned to dress up in more careful language. "Is this my grandmother's room?" he asked. "It is, Your Highness." "I've only been inside it twice," he said, "that I can remember. Once when I was very small, and once last summer, for about a minute, because Father wanted to check something in the desk drawer and brought me along without really meaning to." He looked past me at the door, and something crossed his young face that I recognized, uncomfortably, because I had felt something like it myself standing at that door all morning. The particular ache of wanting to know a person you had never been allowed the chance to know. I don't remember her at all. Everyone says I have her eyes, but I can't check, because there aren't very many pictures of her that show her properly, and the ones there are all formal ones, standing very stiffly for the painter. I don't know what she looked like when she was just sitting somewhere, reading, being a person and not a queen. I did not know in that moment what to say to him, because nothing in 11 years of training had prepared me for the particular task of comforting a boy standing outside his dead grandmother's locked door, asking questions that had no easy answer a guardsman was equipped to give. I settled in the end for the plain truth, offered as gently as I knew how. "I never knew her either, Your Highness. She'd passed before I came to the guard, but everyone who did know her speaks of her the same way, kindly, and a little quietly, the way people speak about someone they still miss rather than someone they've simply filed away in memory. I think that says something true about her, even without a picture to go with it." Torin considered that with the grave seriousness only a child can bring to a stranger's small kindness. "Father's in there today, isn't he? Working on something." "He is." "Is it about her?" I chose my next words carefully, aware that I was standing at the exact edge of what I was permitted to say and what I could honestly claim not to know. "I couldn't tell you for certain what it's about, Your Highness. I only know he asked for the room to be kept private today, and I'm keeping it that way for him." "Even from me?" "Even from the king today," I said. "It isn't about you specifically. It's the same rule for everyone." He absorbed that, and I watched him decide, the way his father and his father's stepmother had both decided before him that morning, that there was nothing personal in a rule applied evenly, even when it stood between him and something he plainly wanted very much. "That's fair, I suppose," he said, with the particular gravity of a boy trying on an adult's reasoning for size and finding it fit better than he expected. "Will you tell him I came by? Not to make him feel he has to explain anything. Just so he knows I thought about her today too, even if I don't really remember her to think about properly." "I'll tell him exactly that, Your Highness." He nodded, satisfied, and wandered back the way he had come, his history book still tucked under his arm, and I stood there afterward with an ache in my chest. I had not expected a boy's simple question to leave there. I did not know, standing in that quiet gallery with the midday sun beginning its long slide toward afternoon, that the letter waiting inside that room had his name, or rather, the space where his name would go written into it already, timed for that very day. I only knew that something in his voice, asking whether he even had a right to want to know a grandmother he had never met, had settled into me and stayed there for the rest of the long watch, a small quiet weight beside the larger one Rowan had already given me to carry. The afternoon that followed was quieter in its traffic but heavier in its waiting, and it is the waiting, more than anything else, that I remember most clearly now when I look back on that day. A palace at rest makes more sound than people imagine. There is the tick of the long case clock at the gallery's far end, the settle of old timber as the day warms and cools, the distant clatter of the kitchen's 2 floors below, the occasional burst of children's laughter carried on the wind from the east lawn where, I guessed, Malin and Bram were being walked by their nurse before their afternoon lessons. I stood and absorbed all of it, the way you learn to after enough years on post, sorting each sound into its proper place without needing to think about it, so that anything out of place would announce itself immediately. For the first 2 hours after Morwenna's visit, nothing announced itself. I heard faintly the low murmur of voices behind the parlor door Rowan's, and the older, rougher voice of Hourik Bayan, rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded, from the outside, like careful conversation rather than argument. Papers rustled. Once I heard the distinct sound of a chair scraping back, quickly, as though someone had risen too fast. I noted it and did nothing, because rising quickly from a chair is not, on its own, a reason to break a locked door, however much my curiosity wanted to make it one. It was somewhere past the middle of the afternoon that the sound changed in a way I could not simply file away. I do not think even now that I can describe it with total precision, because I heard it through a heavy old door and a stone wall, and sound does strange, muffled things under those conditions. But what I heard, unmistakably, was Rowan's voice breaking. Not shouting, nothing like anger, but the particular catch a man's voice takes when grief has come up on him faster than he expected it to. The sound of someone trying to keep speaking through something that wants very badly to stop him. It lasted only a few seconds before it steadied again. But in those few seconds my whole body went taut at that door in a way it had not gone taut all day. Every instinct I had built over 11 years telling me that something inside that room needed attention. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it is the true center of everything that happened that day. I did not think Rowan was in danger. I did not think Hourik Bayan meant him harm. An old man with a satchel of papers is not a threat that 11 years of training teaches you to fear. What I felt was something harder to name and, in its way, harder to resist. The plain, human wish to open that door and make sure the man I had sworn to protect was not sitting alone with something too heavy to carry. Protection, in my line of work, is usually a simple thing to picture: a blade, a crowd, a runaway horse. It is much harder, I discovered that afternoon, to protect a man from grief, because grief does not respect a locked door any more than joy does. And a guard's whole training is built around thresholds that grief simply walks through unbothered. I stood with my hand not quite touching the door and made myself remember, word for word, what Rowan had told me that morning. No interruptions, no exceptions, no matter who asks or how they ask it. He had not said unless something sounds difficult inside. He had not said unless I hear something that worries you. He had drawn the line himself, deliberately, knowing. I understood now, standing there with my pulse loud in my own ears, knowing exactly what kind of afternoon he was about to have, and choosing, with open eyes, to have it behind a locked door rather than have it interrupted by well-meaning hands, mine included. Captain Vane's voice came back to me then, from years before, from a training yard in the rain where he had made a much younger and much more impatient version of me stand at a door for 4 straight hours without once looking through the keyhole, though he had told me, cruelly I thought at the time, that there was something worth seeing on the other side. At the end of the 4 hours he had opened the door himself and shown me an empty room. There was nothing to see, he told me, and that is exactly the lesson. Your curiosity is not a reason. Your worry is not a reason. Only the order or a clear and present danger is a reason. Learn to tell the difference between concern and cause, Corin, or you'll be no use to anyone the day it actually matters. I had resented him for that lesson for a long time. Standing at the Rose Parlour door with my prince's grief leaking faintly through old timber, I understood, finally and completely, what he had been trying to give me. I did not open the door. I stood and I listened for the specific sounds that would have changed my decision: a cry for help, the crash of a struggle, silence where there should have been voices and none of them came. Within a minute or two, the voices steadied again, quieter now, and I heard what I took to be the old man speaking gently, And then, after a while, something that might almost have been the ghost of a laugh threaded through with tears, the particular sound of grief and gladness arriving in the same breath. I let my hand fall back to my side and made myself breathe. It was not 5 minutes after that when the bolt slid and the door opened, and Rowan looked out at me with red-rimmed eyes and a face scrubbed hastily, unsuccessfully, of whatever had passed across it minutes before. "Corin," his voice was steadier than his eyes. "I need something brought from the East Archive, the old records room, the locked press on the north wall. Ask the archivist on duty for the green ledger box marked with my mother's cipher. The crowned eye, tell them it comes on my personal authority, and tell no one why. Can you send someone reliable without leaving this door yourself?" "I can, Your Highness," I thought quickly. "Guardsman Petrus is due to relieve the watch on the east stair in 20 minutes. I can send word ahead and have him fetch it directly rather than wait for his relief." "Good, thank you." He held my eyes a moment longer than the instruction required, and I understood, without either of us saying it aloud, that he had heard himself through that door as clearly as I had, and was silently grateful I had not opened it. "You held the line," he said quietly. "I heard you turn away half the palace today." "I won't forget that, Corin." "It's my post, Your Highness, nothing to forget." "It's more than your post," he said. And then, before I could answer, the bolt slid closed again, and I was left with a new task and a great deal to think about. I sent word by way of a passing footman to catch Petrus before his relief, describing exactly what was wanted and on whose authority, and settled back into my post to wait for the ledger box to arrive. It gave me something to do with the restlessness that lingered in me from those few taut minutes at the door, and I was glad of it, because restlessness left unoccupied has a way of curdling into doubt, and doubt was waiting for me not much further down that long afternoon. It arrived first in the shape of Lord Cassius, Queen Consort Morwenna's eldest son, who came around the gallery corner with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted that a door would open for him. I had always found Cassius pleasant enough in passing, not a man I would call a friend, our stations being what they were, but not one of the arrogant sort either, the sort who mistake a guard's silence for an invitation to be cruel. He slowed when he saw me posted, glanced at the closed door, and raised an eyebrow. "Guardsman Hale, I heard a rather colorful story in the yard just now about my mother being turned away from this very door." He said it lightly, no accusation in it, more the tone of a man collecting an amusing fact to repeat at dinner. "Is it true, or has the servants' hall improved on it again?" "It's true that Her Majesty came by, and I asked her to wait until His Highness was free, my lord. I wouldn't know what's been added to it since." "And now I suppose you'll ask the same of me." "I will, my lord, yes." He studied me for a moment, and I watched him decide, much as his mother had, that there was nothing personal in it worth resenting. "Good," he said finally, with something almost like approval. "I confess I came half hoping you'd wave me through out of respect for the family name, so I could go tell my mother the rule bent for me and not for her, and enjoy her reaction. I'm rather disappointed you're going to deny me that entertainment." He smiled, entirely without malice. "Tell Rowan I called, if it matters, and that I hope whatever he's wrestling with in there resolves kindly. He's carried enough on his own over the years without needing an audience for it." "I'll tell him, my lord." He left as easily as he'd come, and I found myself, not for the first time that day, quietly grateful for the particular character of the family I served. I had heard enough stories, from guardsmen posted at other courts, of households where a closed door was treated as a personal insult by anyone with rank enough to take offense at it. Ours was not that kind of household, not that day at least, and I did not take that for granted. Petrus returned some 40 minutes later, slightly out of breath, cradling a green lacquered box no larger than a hat box, sealed with a ribbon and a small wax stamp bearing a crowned letter I. He handed it over with the careful reverence of a boy who suspects, without being told, that he is carrying something more important than its size would suggest. The archivist said to tell you it's the only one, he said. There's no copy. She made me repeat that back to her twice before she'd let me take it. I knocked the signal, and this time the door opened wider than it had all day, wide enough that I caught a proper look inside for the first time since morning. The Rose Parlour was much as I remembered it from the rare glimpses I'd had over the years. Pale paneling, tall windows, a faded blue settee, and on the low table before it, papers spread in careful rows, and among them, unmistakably, letters, a great many letters, in a hand I did not recognize but which Rowan's face, when he looked at them, told me he recognized perfectly. Halric Byan sat in the window seat, his satchel open and mostly empty beside him, watching the prince with the patient, careful attention of a man who has delivered difficult news and is waiting to see how it lands. Rowan took the green box from me with both hands, the way you take something that might shatter. "Thank you," he said again, quieter this time, and then, before he closed the door, he looked past me down the gallery, toward the long windows and the golden slant of the afternoon light, and said something that I did not fully understand until much later that evening. "Not long now. I need to be sure, and then I need to decide how to do this properly, for everyone, not just for me." He met my eyes. "You've done more today than stand at a door, Corin. I hope you know that." The bolt slid home once more, and I was left again, with the ledger box's absence and a great deal to wonder about, the crowned cipher, the old man's careful satchel, the catch in the prince's voice, and the growing, unshakable sense that whatever was unfolding in that quiet room concerned not just Rowan alone, but the whole shape of a family that had, for a long time, carried a particular kind of silence about the woman whose room this had once been. It was in the lull after Petrus went back to his post that the day handed me the hardest test it had yet offered, harder in its way than turning away the Queen Consort herself, because this one came dressed in the language of real consequence rather than simple wounded pride. A man named Chancellor's first secretary Aldous Penrose came striding down the gallery with two clerks trailing behind him, each carrying a leather dispatch case, and I knew before he opened his mouth that this was not going to be a conversation I could end with a simple courteous refusal. I had dealt with Penrose before. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man entirely consumed by the machinery of his office, the sort who measured every hour of every day against the deadlines it contained, and he wore that particular urgency the way other men wore their rank. "Guardsman Hale." He did not slow as he approached, which meant I had to plant myself rather more firmly than usual to make him stop at all. "I need the prince immediately. This is not a matter that can wait for whatever he's occupied with in there. His Highness gave orders this morning that he isn't to be disturbed, Secretary Penrose. No exceptions." There are always exceptions to a scheduling preference, guardsman, and this is rather more than that. He held up the dispatch case as though its mere presence settled the argument. "The trade accord with the southern principalities lapses at sundown unless it carries the crown prince's counter-signature alongside the king's. We have been chasing that signature for 2 days through no fault of the prince's own calendar, and if it lapses, 3 years of negotiation collapse with it, and a great many people in the border counties who depend on that accord for their livelihood will feel the consequence of it long after you and I have forgotten this conversation ever happened. I need 5 minutes with him, not an audience. 5 minutes and a signature." I want to be honest that this was not Morwenna's graceful curiosity, nor Cassius's easy indulgence, nor even a king's quiet, patient authority. This was a man convinced, with real justification, that the thing he needed mattered more than any order given that morning could possibly have anticipated, and standing against him meant standing against an argument that sounded, on its face, entirely reasonable. I felt the whole weight of it pressing against the flat, simple fact I had been given to hold on to. No interruptions, no exceptions, no matter who asks or how they ask it. I understand the stakes, Secretary Penrose, and I don't doubt a word of what you've told me. But my orders came directly from His Highness this morning, without qualification, and I don't have the authority to weigh one urgent matter against another and decide which one earns the exception. That decision isn't mine to make. Then whose is it? His voice sharpened, the two clerks behind him shifting uneasily, clearly unused to seeing their secretary refused by anyone below the rank of minister. You understand what you're risking, guardsman. If this accord lapses because a guardsman wouldn't knock on a door, questions will be asked, and they won't stop at you, but they will most certainly start with you. It would have been easy in that moment to find the loophole a frightened man finds when the cost of holding firm suddenly looks larger than the cost of bending. To tell myself that Rowan surely hadn't meant to include a matter of state importance when he gave his order, that no reasonable prince would want his own kingdom's interests sacrificed to protect his privacy for an afternoon, that knocking once, quietly, to ask whether he could spare 5 minutes, was hardly the same as flinging the door wide for anyone who asked. I stood with that reasoning available to me, and I set it down, deliberately, the same way I had set down my own worry an hour before at that same door. I'll send word to the king's own office, Secretary Penrose, since His Majesty holds the countersigning authority in the prince's temporary absence, as I understand the law provides for exactly this kind of circumstance. If there's a lawful path to resolving this without breaking the order I've been given, that's it, and I'd rather find it than break my word to my prince over a decision that isn't mine to weigh. Penrose stared at me for a long moment, plainly unaccustomed to being met with a solution rather than either capitulation or stubborn refusal, and something in his expression shifted, grudgingly, toward respect even as his urgency remained undimmed. That provision exists, he admitted, though it requires the king's seal specifically, and I don't know that he'll thank either of us for the last-minute scramble. Then let's not waste the time we have arguing about whose door to knock on next, I said, and sent one of my own runners sprinting for the king's private office with the details of the accord and Penrose's own dispatch case in tow, while Penrose himself, muttering, followed after at a pace just short of undignified. I stood alone at the Rose Parlour door for a long, uneasy stretch after that, turning over what I had just done, uncertain whether I had solved the problem or simply moved it to where it could do more damage, uncertain whether Rowan would return from behind that door to find his own kingdom's business had nearly slipped through a crack in his absence, because a guardsman had been too rigid to bend an inch for it. Word came back within the half-hour, carried by my own runner at a dead run. The king had received Penrose directly, reviewed the accord with the speed of a man who had spent 3 decades learning to read treaties quickly, and applied his own countersignature under the lawful provision for the crown prince's temporary unavailability, precisely as I had guessed the law allowed. The accord was saved. No one's kingdom had suffered for my refusal to bend, and Rowan's afternoon, whatever it still held, had not been interrupted by anyone at all. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been wound tight since Penrose first came striding down the gallery, and I understood, standing there in the aftermath, something Captain Vane had never quite put into words for me, though I think he had always meant to. That holding a line firmly does not require you to be careless of what lies beyond it. It requires you to trust that the world around you has other doors, other paths, other people whose job it is to solve the problems your own rigid post was never meant to solve alone. I had not failed the kingdom by refusing Penrose. I had simply done my own job well enough to let someone else do theirs. King Alaric came himself a little after that, and I confess his arrival was the one I had been quietly dreading all day, more than the Queen Consort's, more than Lord Cassius's, because a king does not simply get told to wait the way other people do, and I had no clear notion of how I was meant to hold a line against my own sovereign, without it costing me something I could not afford to lose. He came without escort, which was itself unusual. Alaric rarely moved through his own palace without at least a secretary or a steward trailing at a respectful distance, if only because there was always some piece of the kingdom's business trailing after him, whether he wanted it to or not. That afternoon he came alone, in a plain coat, walking the way a tired man walks when he has spent the day in rooms that demanded a straighter back than his own tiredness wanted to give. He stopped some 10 paces from the door and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke, and I had the distinct impression that he already knew, in broad strokes, what I was going to say to him. "Guardsman Hale." His voice was quieter than I expected, none of the formal weight he carried in council. "I understand my son has given you rather a difficult day. I also understand you very nearly cost the Southern Accord its signature, and then saved it in the same breath, by pointing Penrose at my own office instead of this door. That was well reasoned under pressure from a man who could easily have simply knocked and let someone else sort out the consequences. I signed it gladly, and I'll tell you plainly it was no trouble to me at all. You found the right door to send him to, which is precisely what I'd have hoped for from anyone standing this post. Thank you, Your Majesty. I wasn't certain I'd read it correctly. You read it exactly right. He allowed himself a small, tired smile. He's given me a clear one, Your Majesty, which isn't quite the same thing, I said. That earned the faintest ghost of a smile. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. He glanced at the closed door, and something moved behind his eyes that I recognized distantly as the same held-breath quality I had seen on Rowan's face that morning, the look of a man who suspected, more than he knew for certain, what lay on the other side of it. I won't ask you to let me in if that eases your evening any. I've had my own message from him already, sent an hour ago by one of the pages. He asked me to wait for his word, same as everyone else, and told me plainly he'd rather I hear it from him directly than force it out of a guard who's only doing as he's told. He paused. I take it that's precisely what you'd have told me had I pushed. It is, Your Majesty. Word for word, more or less. Then I'm glad I didn't make you say it. He looked at the door a moment longer, and I watched something soften in his face, an old grief moving under the surface the way it does in a man who has learned over many years to carry it without letting it show in the ordinary run of a day. This room hasn't been opened like this since she died, he said, more to himself than to me. Not once, not even by me. He was quiet for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he turned that same searching look on me directly. Do you know what today is, Guardsman Hale? I did not, and told him so. No reason you should, he said. It isn't marked on any calendar I've ever kept publicly. It's the day she would have called Torrens' name-day feast, when he was born, not his birth date exactly, but the day the old custom says a child's name is truly settled on them, 11 years past. She was very particular about the old customs. I'd nearly forgotten it myself, until my son reminded me of it this morning, quite by accident in the middle of something else entirely. He shook his head slowly, and whatever he was thinking, he did not share the rest of it with me. Whatever he's doing in there, he said instead, I trust him to do it right. He always has where his mother is concerned, more than the rest of us managed some years. He straightened, some of the day's tiredness visibly folding itself back beneath the composure a king wears the way another man wears a coat. You've done well today holding this. I mean that plainly, not as a kindness. A great many guards would have found a reason to make an exception for me, if not for their prince's stepmother, then certainly for their king. I'm glad you didn't. Thank you, Your Majesty. Send word the moment he opens that door, he said, already turning to go. I'll be in my study, and Guardsman Hale, he paused, glancing back. Whatever waiting he still has ahead of him, make sure he isn't alone in it longer than he needs to be. A man can carry grief by himself for exactly as long as it takes him to remember. He doesn't have to. He left the way he'd come, unescorted, and I stood turning his words over for a long while afterward, the name-day feast, the room untouched since Isolde's death, the strange mixture of grief and gladness I had heard through the door hours before. I did not yet have all the pieces, but I could feel the shape of them beginning to assemble themselves into something larger than a single confidential meeting, and the shape, whatever it turned out to be, did not frighten me. If anything, it steadied me, the way the outline of a familiar country steadies a traveler still lost in its middle distance. It was not long after the king's visit, perhaps 3/4 of an hour, with the afternoon light beginning its long, slow tilt toward evening, that the door opened again, and this time it was Halric Bayan who stood in the gap, not Rowan. "The prince asks that you send for Princess Alara," the old man said. "Quietly, if you can manage it, he'd rather not have the whole gallery watching her walk down to us. He says you'll know how." I did know how. I sent a discreet word through one of the pages still lingering near the correspondence table, asking that Princess Alara be told, privately and without fuss, that her husband wished to see her at the Rose Parlour at her earliest convenience. She came within the quarter hour alone, without ladies or fanfare, moving with the quick, purposeful step of a woman who has learned to read urgency in the smallest details of a summons. She paused before me only long enough to ask quietly, "Is he all right, Corin?" And I told her, as honestly as I could, that he was well, and that I believed whatever waited for her inside that room was good, even if it did not feel entirely easy. "He wouldn't tell me anything this morning," she said, half to herself, glancing toward the closed door as though she might read something useful in the grain of the wood itself. "Only that he needed the day, and that he'd explain everything the moment he could. I've been married to that man long enough to know when the moment I can means something that frightens him a little, even when it isn't a frightening thing at its heart. He gets a certain look before he tells me something that matters to him more than he can easily say, quiet and careful, like he's afraid of dropping it." She managed a small, unsteady smile. "I saw that look this morning at breakfast, right before he left the table earlier than usual. I should have guessed something was coming. For what it's worth, Your Highness, I don't believe there's anything in that room to be afraid of. Difficult, perhaps. Not dangerous. That's usually the harder kind in my experience," she said, with the particular rueful wisdom of a woman who had learned, over years of marriage to a man carrying a great deal of quiet history, that the difficult and the dangerous were rarely the same thing, however much they could feel alike from the outside. She nodded, took a breath the way a person takes a breath before stepping into cold water, and went in. The bolt did not slide home behind her. I noticed that, and filed it away as one more piece of the shape assembling itself in my mind. The circle was widening now, one careful name at a time. Through the gap left by the unlatched door, before it settled fully closed behind her, I caught the barest glimpse of the room's interior, lamplight now, since the afternoon had begun its long fade toward evening, gold and warm across the pale paneling, and Rowan rising from where he'd been seated to meet his wife halfway across the floor, both hands out to take hers before she'd even finished crossing the threshold. I heard faintly her soft exclamation at whatever she saw spread across that low table, and then the door swung the rest of the way shut on its own weight, and I was left once more with nothing but sound to go on, though the sound, now, was gentler than anything I'd heard from that room all day. I found myself thinking, in the quiet that followed, about the particular kind of trust a household like this one is built on. Not the trust that assumes nothing will ever go wrong, but the trust that allows a man to disappear behind a locked door for the better part of a day, certain that the people who love him will wait, worried but patient, rather than force their way to him out of a fear that he might not manage whatever he was carrying alone. I had spent 11 years standing in rooms full of people accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted the moment they wanted it, and I had come, gradually, to measure a household's true character not by how grandly it celebrated its good days, but by how gracefully it handled being asked to wait on its hard ones. By that measure, whatever else the day had cost any of us, it had told me something quietly remarkable about the family I served. I want to admit something here, because I think an honest account of that day requires it. Somewhere in the hour that followed Ilara's arrival, doubt found me in a way it had not managed all day. It came, as doubt often does, in the quiet after the difficult moments had passed rather than during them. A kind of delayed unease that crept in once I had time enough to stand still and think. I found myself running back over the afternoon, the catch in Rowan's voice, the chair scraping back too fast, the moment I had stood with my hand almost on that door and chosen, deliberately, not to open it. I had told myself, in the moment, that I was honoring his order and trusting his judgment. Standing there hours later with the light going long and amber through the gallery windows, I began to wonder whether I had simply been afraid of overstepping, afraid of a king's displeasure, afraid of being the guardsman who broke a promise rather than the guardsman who read a room correctly and acted. What if the sound I had heard had been worse than grief finding its footing? What if my faith in Rowan's own judgment had been, in the end, only a comfortable excuse to do the easier thing? It is a strange kind of doubt, the kind that arrives after you have already done the right thing and cannot quite believe, in hindsight, that you were right to do it. I have talked to enough older guardsmen since to know it is a common enough affliction among people in my line of work. The second guessing that comes precisely because you were trained to notice everything, and are then asked to act on almost none of it, to let a closed door remain closed even when every instinct in you strains against it. I did not have an easy answer for myself that hour, standing alone in the gallery with the ledger box gone from my hands and the family filtering, one by one, into a room I still could not see into. All I had was the plain fact that no one had come out shaken, no one had come out afraid, and the voices behind the door, when I strained to hear them, had settled by then into something that sounded, unmistakably, like quiet joy threaded through with old sorrow. The sound, I would come to understand before the night was through, of a family finding something they had not known they'd lost. My relief was due at the 6th hour past midday. A young guardsman named Devon Ash, who had trained 2 years behind me and who arrived promptly, as he always did, ready to take the post and free me for supper and rest. I found, when the moment actually came, that I did not want to leave. "I can take it from here, Corin," Devon said, a little puzzled at my hesitation, since handing off a post is usually the easiest transaction in our whole trade. "You've had a long stretch of it by the look of you." "I have," I admitted, "but I'd like to stay if it can be arranged. I've been at this door since before dawn, and whatever's happening in there is close to its end, I think, and I'd rather see it through than hand it to someone who's had to piece the day together second-hand." I hesitated, aware of how strange the request might sound. "It isn't that I don't trust you with it, Devon. It's that I've earned something today, standing here, and I'd like to be the one who's still standing here when it finishes." Devon studied me for a moment, and then, to his credit, simply nodded. "I'll tell the sergeant you asked to extend," he said. "No one's going to fault a man for wanting to see a long watch through to its end. I'll stand with you if you like the company, or I'll leave you to it." "Stand with me," I said, and was glad, more than I could easily explain, that I would not have to spend the last hours of that strange day entirely alone. The two of us took up positions on either side of the Rose Parlour door, as the light outside finally began to fail in earnest, the gallery windows going from gold to gray to the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere behind that door, a family I had spent a lifetime protecting was, though I did not yet know the whole of it, finally being given back something that had been lost to them since long before most of them had ever set foot in that room. Devon and I did not talk much in that last stretch, which suited us both. There is a particular companionship in standing a long watch beside another guardsman who understands, without needing it explained, that silence is not the same as having nothing to say. Once he asked me quietly whether I thought we'd ever learn what all of it had been about, and I told him I thought we would, before the night was out, though I could not have told him why I believed it so certainly. I think it was simply that the sounds coming from behind that door had changed their character entirely by then. No more catches in the voice, no more scraping chairs, only a long, low murmur punctuated now, and then by something that might have been laughter, might have been tears, and was very likely, I have come to believe since, both at once. It was full dark, the gallery lit by the wall sconces the evening footman had come through to light an hour before, when the door finally opened wide, not the cautious hands-width gap of the morning, but thrown back fully, warm lamplight spilling out across the gallery floor, and Crown Prince Rowan stood in the frame looking like a man who had spent the day being taken apart and carefully put back together in a better shape than he'd started in. His eyes were still red-rimmed, but there was nothing broken in his face any longer. If anything, he looked lighter than I had seen him look in a long while, the particular lightness of a man who has set down a weight he did not know he was still carrying. "Corin," he said my name, and then glancing at Devon added, "And Ash, is it? Good. I'll need you both, if you don't mind one more errand tonight, though I promise this is the last one, and it's a kinder one than the rest." "Whatever you need, Your Highness." "I need the family brought together," he said. "All of them properly tonight, my father, my brothers Cale and Edmund and their wives if they can be found on short notice, my sister Adela," and he paused, and I watched him choose his next words with visible care, "and Queen Consort Morwenna, especially her. I turned her away this morning, and I intend to make certain she's the very first one I send for now that the waiting's done. Tell her exactly that if she asks why. That she was first, not last, on the list once the door was finally opened to be opened." Something in my chest eased at that, a tightness I had not fully realized I was carrying since the moment that morning, when I had watched Morwenna walk away from a closed door with grace she had not been obligated to offer. I had believed her, standing there, when she said she held no grievance in it. It mattered more than I expected, hearing Rowan confirm with his own choice that her grace had not gone unnoticed, and that whatever waited on the other side of that door was, in the end, meant for her as fully as for anyone who shared that family's name. "And the children," Rowan added, as Devon and I moved to go, "Malin and Torin, especially Bram if he's not already asleep, though I understand if his nurse would rather not wake him. Tell them," he hesitated again, and this time something almost shy crossed his face, an expression I had rarely seen him wear in public. "Tell them their father has something that belonged to their grandmother, and that she left it for them, and that tonight is the night they get to have it." We went. I will not pretend the next half hour was anything but a small, quiet flurry of activity dressed up as calm, messages sent, doors knocked on gently, a household staff drawn briefly and discreetly into the current of something they could sense mattered without yet understanding why. Duke Edmund and Duchess Sylvie were found at their own apartments and came at once, Sylvie carrying a look of quiet, careful curiosity that I would later learn was entirely characteristic of her. Prince Cale and Lady Imogen arrived not long after, Cale moving with the particular brisk energy of a man glad of any excuse to be near his family after years when that had not always been simple for him. Princess Adela came last among the adults, having been furthest afield in the palace's east wing, but she came quickly once summoned, and I noticed, when she passed me in the gallery, that her eyes were already bright with the anticipation of something she seemed, somehow, to have half-guessed already. I was the one who carried the message to Queen Consort Morwenna myself. I asked for the privilege, and Devon, understanding without needing it explained, let me take it. I found her in her private sitting room, still in the gray wool she had worn that afternoon, a book open on her lap that she did not appear to have been reading with any real attention. She looked up when I was announced, and something wary and hopeful moved across her face at once, the look of a woman who had spent the last several hours turning the day's strange refusal over in her mind, and had not yet arrived at an answer she was satisfied with. "Guardsman Hale," she said, "has something happened? His Highness asks that you come to the Rose Parlour, Your Majesty. The whole family is being gathered. I paused, because I had been given exact words to deliver, and I did not intend to deliver them poorly. He asked me to tell you that you were the first name on his list tonight, not the last. The first, because he turned you away this morning, and he wanted to be certain you knew that the moment the door was finally open, it was open for you as much as for anyone who shares his family's name. I watched the words land, and I will remember, for as long as I keep any memory at all, the particular way Morwenna's composure, that famous, carefully held composure that had weathered so many rooms far less kind than this one, simply gave way, all at once, gently, the way a held breath finally lets go. She pressed one hand briefly to her mouth, closed the book in her lap without marking her place, and rose. "Thank you, Corin," she said, and it was the first time all day she had used my given name without the guardsman attached to it. "Thank you for telling me that exactly the way you did." She smiled, unsteady but entirely genuine, and reached out to touch my arm briefly as she passed, a small, human gesture that no ceremony in that palace required of her. "I told you this afternoon I hoped whatever he was doing in there was good for him. I don't think I let myself hope it might be good for the rest of us as well." We walked back to the Rose Parlour together, and I will admit that some part of me, the part that had spent 11 years learning to want nothing more from any of my postings than a quiet end to a long watch, was glad beyond simple duty that I would be there to see how the day finished. By the time we arrived, the gallery outside the parlor had filled with the low, warm murmur of a family gathering. Edmund and Sylvie speaking quietly by the window, Cale crouched down to say something that made his young niece laugh, Adela standing near the door with her arms folded and an expression of fond, expectant patience. Malin and Torin had been brought down by their nurse, both still in their day clothes. Malin bright-eyed with the particular alertness children have when they sense something important is happening and have not yet been told what. Torin trying, not entirely successfully, to look as though 11 years had made him too old for this kind of excitement. Bram, true to his nurse's earlier guess, had already been asleep, and it had been decided, gently, to let him stay that way. There would be time enough for him to know all of it later, when he was old enough to hold it properly. King Alaric stood a little apart from the rest, near enough to be part of the gathering and far enough that I understood, watching him, that he was giving his son the space to be the one who opened the door rather than stepping forward to do it himself, though every line of him strained toward that room. When Morwenna appeared beside me in the gallery, he crossed to her at once, took her hand, and said something too quiet for me to hear, though I saw her nod, her eyes bright, and saw him press her hand once before releasing it. Duchess Sylvie caught my eye as I came to stand near the doorway and crossed to me for a moment, her voice pitched low beneath the general murmur of the gathering. "Is it good news, Corin? You've had the longest look at his face today of anyone here. I trust your read on it more than anything the rumor mill's been serving up since noon." "I believe it is, Your Grace. Whatever it costs him to say it, I don't think it's costing him anything he regrets carrying." She studied me a moment, and something in her steady, careful eyes told me she had already guessed a good deal more than she was letting on. "Edmund's been fielding wild theories from half the household staff all afternoon," she said, with the faint, dry humor I would come to learn was entirely characteristic of her. "A secret trial, a foreign prince come to propose to Adela without her knowledge. My personal favorite involved a ghost." She smiled properly then, warm rather than wry. "I rather think the truth, whatever it turns out to be, will be kinder than any of it." Prince Cale, standing near enough to catch the last of that exchange, laughed under his breath, a low, easy sound that seemed to carry some private relief of his own in it. "I've had my share of hard days behind closed doors in this family," he said, quietly enough that it was clearly meant for those nearby rather than the whole gallery. "Days when I was the one people were waiting on the other side of a door for, wondering what I'd say when I finally came out of whatever room I'd shut myself into." I know what it costs a person to ask for that kind of privacy, and I know what it means when the rest of the family's willing to give it without making him pay for asking. He glanced toward the closed door, something unguarded and fond in his face. Whatever this is, I hope it's the kind of hard that ends somewhere good. He's earned that, if anyone in this family has. Lady Imogen, at his side, said nothing, but reached over and laced her fingers briefly through his. And I understood, watching the two of them, that whatever old estrangement had once stood between Cale and the rest of this family had been mended thoroughly enough that a night like this one found him standing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, rather than at any remove from them. Princess Adela, arms still folded, watched the door with the particular patience of the eldest child in any family, the one who has learned, over the better part of a lifetime, that the important things in a household usually arrive on their own schedule and rarely reward those who try to hurry them. Our mother used to say the same thing about Isolde that half this palace still says about her, she offered, apropos of nothing, to no one in particular, though I understood the words were meant, in some oblique way, for the room at large. That she never did anything by half measures where the people she loved were concerned. If she left something behind for this family, I'd wager everything I own that it was left with the same whole heart she gave to everything else. She looked toward Morwenna as she said it, not unkindly, and something passed between the two women that I did not fully understand until later, an old, complicated history between a king's sister and a king's second wife, settled, on this particular night, into something gentler than it might once have been. Rowan came to the threshold then, and I have rarely seen a man look more nervous about giving good news than he looked in that moment, as though some part of him still feared that whatever he had spent the day confirming might somehow slip away from him, the instant he tried to share it aloud. "Thank you all for coming so quickly," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried easily in the hushed gallery. "I owe you an explanation before anything else, and I owe an apology to some of you for the manner of today, though I hope, by the end of this, you'll understand why I asked for it the way I did." His eyes found Morwenna's, and he held them a moment. "I turned you away this morning, and I'm sorry for how that must have felt, arriving at your own stepson's door and being refused without a reason given. I want you to know it was never about you. It was about me, not yet being certain enough of what I was holding to share it with anyone, and needing to be certain before I let a single other person's hope rest on it." "You don't owe me an apology, Rowan," Morwenna said, and her voice, though thick with feeling, was steady. "Your guard already told me everything I needed to hear tonight. I understood the moment he said it." Rowan's mouth curved, briefly, gratefully. Even so. He looked around at the rest of them, his father, his brothers, his sister, his wife already inside, his children watching him with wide, waiting eyes, and seemed to gather himself. "This morning, a man named Howrick Byon came to me with something I did not know existed. Some of you may remember him, distantly. He was a groundskeeper here, decades ago, before most of you were born or old enough to notice the staff, and he was, for a time, one of the very few people my mother trusted completely with things she did not want widely known. He came to me today because his late wife, going through her late sister's cottage after her passing this past winter, found a chest that had been stored there, sealed, for longer than either sister could properly remember, stored there. We now believe, at my mother's own request, sometime in the last year of her life, when she already knew how little time she had left." He paused, and Howrick Byon, still seated quietly in the window, gave a small, confirming nod, as though he had been asked to bear witness and took the responsibility seriously. King Alaric looked at the old man for a long moment, something working behind his tired eyes, and then said, quietly, "Byon, you kept the west border hedges, when I was young enough to still be chased out of them for hiding in the roses. It was not quite a question. Isolde used to say you were the only member of the household staff who never once treated her like a queen when she came out to the gardens, that you argued with her about pruning shears the same way you'd have argued with anyone else, and that it was the most restful conversation she had most weeks. She said much the same to me, more than once, Your Majesty, Bayan said, and something in the old man's careful composure loosened, just slightly, at being remembered so precisely after so many years. I never held with treating a person differently for the crown on their head. She seemed to like that about me, near as I could tell, though she never said so outright. She wasn't the sort to hand out compliments loosely. When she asked me, near the end, whether I'd keep something safe for her without asking too many questions about it, I didn't hesitate. It felt like the least I owed a woman who'd spent a decade arguing with me about roses as an equal, not as a queen doing a groundskeeper a kindness. Alaric nodded slowly, and something passed across his face that looked, for just a moment, like the particular gratitude reserved for people who have quietly kept faith with someone you loved long after that person was gone to thank them for it themselves. Inside that chest, Rowan went on, were letters, dozens of them, written in my mother's own hand in the last months before she died, to people she loved and to moments she knew she would not live to see. His voice caught again, briefly, the same catch I had heard through the door hours before, and this time no wall stood between it and the family gathered to hear it. She wrote knowing she was dying and knowing exactly what she would miss. She wrote to my father. She wrote to me. She wrote. He looked at Torrin, and something in his face made the boy go very still. To a grandson she never got to meet, timed for the day the old custom says his name would be truly settled on him, 11 years after his birth. Today. She wrote it not knowing his name yet, because he wasn't born yet, and she left space in the letter for whoever loved him to fill it in before it was given, because she trusted that whoever came after her would love him enough to know what to write there. Torrin's face in that moment was a study I will not forget, disbelief, and something under the disbelief that looked almost like fear of hoping too much, and under that plainly, a longing so old and so quiet that I understood, watching its surface, that it must have lived in him for years without ever quite finding words. Malin had taken his hand without either of them seeming to notice they'd done it. I needed to be certain the letters were real before I let any of you hope for a moment they might be, Rowan said. That's why the door was locked, and why I couldn't tell even you, Father, what I was doing until I knew. I have watched too many people in too many positions be handed false comfort by forgeries and cruel jokes to risk that happening to this family, with something this precious. Mr. Bayan and I spent the day confirming everything we could confirm. The hand, the seal, the details only she would have known, cross-checked against her own old correspondence in the archive. I am as certain as any living person can be. These are her words. She wrote them for us. He looked down at the green lacquered box, now open on the low table behind him, papers arranged with visible care. And there is one more thing I need to say, because I think it matters more than any of the rest, and it's the reason I wanted Morwenna here before anyone else tonight. He lifted a single letter from the box, its paper gone soft and pale gold with age, and held it a moment before he spoke again. My mother knew, near the end, that my father would go on living long after she was gone, and that in time, if he was fortunate, he might love again, and that whoever he loved might come to raise the children he hoped still to have. She did not know who that would be. She could not have known it would be you, Morwenna. But she wrote a letter anyway, addressed to no one by name, because she wanted whoever it turned out to be to know, before they ever doubted it for a moment, that she did not begrudge them the joy of it. That she hoped, whoever they were, that they would be loved in this family the way she had been, and that they would love the children, mine, and any who came after, as fully as if those children had been born to them instead. He crossed the room and put the letter into Morwenna's hands. I will not try to describe every word of what followed, because some of it is not mine to describe. A family's grief and gladness, arriving together in a room that had waited 11 years to hold both at once, is not something a guard standing respectfully near the threshold has any right to turn into a tidy account for strangers. I will say only what I saw, because I think it is worth setting down. I saw Morwenna read that letter with both hands trembling and finish it, and press it once to her chest before she could trust her voice enough to speak. I saw King Alaric go to her without a word and simply stand beside her, his hand at her back, while she read it a second time more slowly. I saw Torrin open his own letter with Rowan's steady hand guiding his, and heard him read the blank space left for his name, and watched Rowan write it in, right there, in front of everyone, in a hand that shook only slightly, Torrin. I saw Malin ask, in the plain, unguarded way children ask the questions adults spend years working up the courage for, whether there was a letter for her too, and saw Rowan tell her, gently, that there was, timed for a year not yet arrived, and that he would keep it safe until it was time, the way his mother had trusted someone to keep it safe for him. And I saw Rowan, once the first wave of it had settled, turn and look for me across the room, and beckon me in from the threshold where I had been standing, quietly, the way I had stood all day. "Come in, Corin," he said. "You held this door longer than anyone alive today except perhaps Mr. Byron here, and you did it without once asking me why, and without once making it easier for yourself at anyone else's expense. You should see how it ends, not just how it began." I stepped inside the Rose Parlour for the first time in all my years at Harrogate, past the threshold I had spent an entire day guarding, and found the room exactly as warm and exactly as full of quiet grief and quiet joy as the voices I had listened to through the door all afternoon had promised it would be. Howrick Byron caught my eye from his window seat and gave me a small, tired smile, the smile of a man who has carried a difficult errand a very long way and is glad, finally, to set it down among people who understood its weight. Later that evening, once the first flood of it had settled into something quieter, he told me a little of how the chest had come to him. His late wife's sister had kept house for a family in the far south of the kingdom for decades, and had never once, in all that time, told even her own husband what she was minding for the old queen, out of a promise made so long ago that by the end she had half convinced herself it no longer mattered. It was only clearing the cottage after her death that the chest had surfaced at all, tucked beneath a floorboard with a single letter on top addressed, simply, to whichever of Isolde's people still lived to receive it. Byron had known Rowan as a boy, decades before, well enough to bring it to him directly rather than through any official channel, and well enough to trust that the prince would treat it with the care it deserved rather than the spectacle a smaller man might have been tempted toward. I stayed in that room longer than my post technically required, though no one seemed to mind, and Devon held the empty gallery outside without complaint, understanding, I think, that some watches end not at the appointed hour, but at the moment their purpose is finally fulfilled. I watched King Alaric read his own letter alone by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders moving in a way I chose, out of the same respect that had kept me from that door all day, not to watch too closely. I watched Princess Alara draw Torrin and Malin both into her arms at once, the three of them a single knot of relief and wonder. I watched Morwenna fold her letter carefully, put it inside her own coat where it would sit close, and cross the room to Rowan, and take both his hands in hers, and say something to him quietly enough that I did not hear it, though I saw what it did to his face, and I did not need to hear the words to understand that whatever debt he had felt he owed her for that morning's closed door had been settled, fully and gently, between them. Before the room began to empty, Malin came and found me where I stood near the door, tugging once at my sleeve with the unself-conscious familiarity children extend to guards they have grown up trusting. She held nothing in her hands. Her own letter, as Rowan had explained, was still years from its appointed day, but her face was bright with the particular contentment of a child who has watched something good happen to people she loves and has decided, generously, to be glad of it on their behalf rather than jealous of what she herself has yet to receive. "Torrin's letter has a poem in it," she informed me solemnly, as though passing on a piece of state intelligence, "about a bird that flies out over the sea and always finds its way home again, no matter how far it goes. He let me read it twice before Father put it away safely. I think it might be the nicest thing I've ever heard, and I didn't even know her. She considered this a moment longer, chewing on the thought the way children chew on ideas too large to swallow whole. Do you think, when mine comes, it'll have a poem too? I couldn't say for certain, Your Highness, I told her. But from everything I've heard of your grandmother today, I'd wager she didn't do anything by half measures for the people she loved. I expect whatever's waiting for you will be exactly as much hers as his was. That seemed to satisfy her completely. She nodded once, decisively, the way children do when an answer has met whatever private standard they were testing it against, and skipped off to find her mother, leaving me with a small, warm ache in my chest that I carried with me for the rest of that long night. It was very late by the time the family began, one by one, to make their way back to their own quarters, each of them carrying some piece of paper that had not existed for them that morning and would, I suspected, matter to them for the whole of their lives from that point forward. Rowan was the last to leave the parlor besides myself, and he stood a moment in the doorway looking back at the room, his mother's room, unlocked now in more ways than one, before he turned to me. I asked a great deal of you today, he said. More than I usually ask of anyone standing a single watch. I want you to understand why, now that you know all of it. I couldn't risk a rumor starting before I was certain, because a rumor like that, half-formed and unconfirmed, could have done real damage to my father if it had turned out to be nothing. To Torrin, if word had reached him before I knew for certain, there truly was a letter with his name waiting to be written into it. Even to Morwenna, if the wrong version of the story had reached her first, garbled by gossip into something that sounded like exclusion rather than care. The only way to protect all of them from that was to protect the door itself, evenly, without exception, until I was ready to open it on my own terms. He looked at me steadily. That's a hard thing to ask a man to do without explaining it to him first. I know that. I'm grateful you did it anyway, on nothing but my word. That's the whole of the job, Your Highness, I said, trusting the order even when you can't see the reason behind it yet. I'd rather earn that kind of trust than be told everything and asked to do nothing hard with it. He studied me a moment, and something in his exhausted, grateful face made me think, not for the first time that day, of his father's words in the gallery hours before, that the whole of the crown's dignity rested on whether the newest guardsman in the yard would tell a duke no as readily as a beggar. You turned away the Queen Consort of Eldermore today, he said, and by evening she was thanking you for it with tears in her eyes. I don't imagine there are many days in a guardsman's career quite like that one. No, Your Highness, I agreed. I don't imagine there are. I think about that day often, now, more than a year on, whenever a new guardsman under my supervision. I hold a sergeant's rank now, largely, I believe, because of how that day was reported up through the ranks by people who had no reason to exaggerate it, asks me the question every new guardsman eventually asks, in one form or another. What do you do when the order and the instinct pull in different directions? When the person on the other side of your discipline outranks you enough to make refusing them feel like a risk not worth taking? I tell them what Captain Vane told me in the rain, all those years ago, though I understand it now in a way I did not understand it then. The door does not care who you are. It is not an insult when it holds against you, and it is not a favor when it opens for you. It is simply fair, in a world that does not offer fairness nearly as often as it ought to. And fairness, applied without exception, is very often the kindest thing a person in a position of small power can offer to people who hold a great deal more power than he does. I have told this story in one form or another to every guardsman I have trained since, not as a boast, because there is little in it that reflects any particular cleverness on my part, but because I think it teaches something the training yard alone cannot. Discipline is easy to demonstrate against people who deserve to be refused. Anyone can hold a line against a drunk, a thug, A man who has clearly earned the word no by the way he asks for entry. The harder discipline, the kind that actually tests a guardsman's character rather than merely his nerve, is the discipline that holds evenly against people who have done nothing at all to deserve refusal. A kind stepmother checking on a son she loves. A king asking after his own child. A secretary carrying a genuine crisis in a leather case. It would have been easy, that day, to tell myself that surely this person or that person was the reasonable exception the rule hadn't quite anticipated. The whole of what I learned, standing at that door from dawn until well past dark, was that the moment you start deciding for yourself who deserves the exception, the rule stops being a rule at all, and becomes instead a reflection of your own guesses about who matters more than whom. Rowan never asked me to guess. He asked me to hold evenly, and to trust that he would explain himself once he was able, and that trust, offered honestly in both directions, turned out to be worth more than any exception I might have granted out of good intentions. I think, too, about Morwenna, more often than I expected to when that day began. I think about the particular grace she showed, standing outside a closed door with every reason in the world to resent it, and choosing instead to see in my refusal the same thing her husband's mother had once tried to teach her, that a rule which bends for no one is worth a great deal more than a rule that bends for everyone but the person standing in front of you. I think about the letter she carried out of that room, and the quiet, private certainty in her face when she left, and I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand that morning when I first stood in her path with my hand raised, that being stopped at a door is not always a small thing done to a person. Sometimes it is the very thing that makes what waits on the other side of it worth having, once the waiting is finally over. I think of one afternoon in particular, some months after that long day, when I found myself posted near the West Gallery again on an ordinary rotation, and happened to pass the Rose Parlour's open door. I slowed, out of old habit more than anything, and saw Torrens sitting alone on the faded blue settee, his grandmother's letter open on his knee, reading it in the unhurried, private way of someone revisiting a favorite passage rather than encountering it for the first time. He looked up when my shadow crossed the threshold, and, seeing it was me, did not fold the letter away the way a boy might with a stranger, but simply smiled, a little sheepish, the way people are when caught doing something tender in a room they'd thought was empty. "I still come here sometimes," he said, "when I want to remember she was real and not just a name everyone speaks about carefully. Father says that's exactly what she'd have wanted, that the room stop being a place people avoid and start being a place people actually live in a little, the way she used to." He glanced down at the letter again, at the poem about the bird that always found its way home, and something in his young face had settled since that first afternoon I'd met him wandering the gallery with his history book, an old ache resolved into something quieter and more at peace with itself. "You were the one standing outside the door that whole day, weren't you, before we knew what any of it was?" "I was, Your Highness." "Thank you for not letting anyone in," he said, with the same grave sincerity he'd shown me that first afternoon, "even though I wanted in more than almost anyone. I understand now why it mattered that you didn't." I did not have a practiced answer for that, and I found I did not need one. I simply told him it had been my honor to stand there, which was nothing more than the plain truth, and left him to his letter and his grandmother's memory, and went back to my post at the gallery's far end with something settled and whole in my own chest that I have carried with me, quietly, ever since. The Rose Parlour is not kept locked anymore. It is opened regularly now, aired properly, visited often, by Torrens, who keeps his letter in a drawer beside his bed and reads it, I am told, more often than he would ever admit to his father. By Malin, who counts down, half in jest and half in genuine longing, the years until her own letter comes due. By Morwenna, who has taken, in the time since, to bringing fresh roses in from the garden herself rather than leaving it to the household staff, a small private ritual no one asked of her, and that she has never once explained, though I think, by now, everyone in that family understands it well enough not to need the explanation. I still stand post outside that door from time to time, on the ordinary rotation any guardsman draws, and it is these days the easiest post in the whole palace. No locked bolt, no held breath, nothing behind it any longer but a room finally at peace with itself, and a family that learned on one long and difficult day exactly what it meant to trust a closed door, and exactly what it could mean when it finally, rightfully, opened.